Dear students, I am DrRadha Sinha. I have a multidisciplinary background. At present, I am a visiting faculty at SVT College of Home Science and a few other colleges in Mumbai. The title of the paper which I am going to talk about today is 20th Century Maharashtra up to 1960. This is unit number 3, Economic Development. This unit has 3 aspects. One is agriculture, the second is transport and communications, and the third is industry. Let us look at the first one, that is agriculture as an economic development in 20th century Maharashtra. I give a brief introduction of the topic. Maharashtra has a largely drought-prone dry lands. As the eastern region forms part of the Deccan Plateau, it has a geological structure of black rock. Hence, underground water resources are limited. Rivers become dry after the rains are over. Like the rest of India, a majority of the population in the state were agriculturists and dependent on agriculture for their livelihood. Irrigation from rivers is possible only in a very few areas. Even then, the policies of the administration were such that almost 60% to 70% of the total irrigation schemes supplied the sugar cane growing areas only, as it was a cash crop. Maharashtra also had agricultural produce of cotton, cereals, oilseeds, pulses, vegetables and fruits. The crops had perennial shortage of water and depended on monsoons only. The irrigation potential is quite limited to about 70.6 lakh hectares. Although Maharashtra is one of the most industrialized and urbanized states, agriculture still dominates with about 55% of the population dependent on the land. After this brief introduction, let us discuss the trends of agriculture in the beginning of the 20th century. Agricultural production in the beginning of the 20th century showed a decline. In general, during this period, there was a lack of growth. By 1950, the failure of the rural economy was obvious, but the causes are very complex and remain obscure. The crucial issue for the historians of agricultural performance in India is not to explain the absence of growth, but discover why growth remained isolated, spasmodic, and short-lived. The slow overall growth rate in agricultural output in the period 1900 to 1947 is in sharp contrast to the growth rate of 2.2% per annum in the decade after independence, that is 1951 to 1961. Let us study what are the causes of this decline in the previous part of the century. Land policies of the British played a very crucial role. So let us examine these land policies. Starting from 19th century, the land policy adopted by the British rulers brought about transformation in the agriculture. They introduced new forms of land tenure and taxation and imposed new patterns of trade, thereby changing the old economic system. These new conceptions of inland settlement were quite alien to Indian conditions, and the equilibrium of the Indian society was deeply disturbed. The new land system introduced in the 19th century all over India had already brought about a revolution in the property relations and also on the basis of the organization of the rural society. As James Mills states in his History of India, it was a revolution much greater probably than any previous conjecture. A total change in the management of revenues more deeply affected the conditions individually and collectively of the people of India. It was an innovation by which the whole property of the country, along with its administration of justice, was placed on a new foundation. Let us look at the implications of these economic changes. The ills which ailed the agriculture of Maharashtra during the last half of the British rule in India clearly has its roots mainly in the breaking down of the old rural systems and not replacing them with any new systems. Hence, we find the land-holding individuals could not muster sufficient labor forces for large-scale production, nor they had capital to invest, and as individuals they could not arrange for irrigation. They only produced for survival. As in other parts of India, disruption of the village organization was a consequence of the administrative setup introduced by the British. In the Deccan region also, howsoever much Mons Druitt, Elphinstone and Chaplin as administrators of the Deccan may have shown regard for old village institutions, and howsoever carefully they might have pursued their policies of reform, the type of government they established was bound to dislocate the organization of the village community. The district collector, for example, was given powers of supervising and controlling over the village officials and the village finance. The Patil and the Kulkarni, who were formerly dependent economically on the village community and formed an integral part of the village organization, were now made servants of the government, and they were made economically dependent on it. As they were paid by the state, naturally they were bound to be first servants of the state and then of the people. Thus the Patil lost all his prestige and was reduced to the status of an inferior servant. This step laid an axe to the roots of the ancient tradition and plucked asunder the governed and the governing, and destroyed the tradition, never to be rebuilt even to this day. Thus we see that British policies of the 19th century destroyed the village self-government system and introduced strong centralization. This policy sapped the independence and initiative of self-help among the villagers. It created a spirit of helplessness and crippled the energy to develop. In other words, the government undertook to do for the people what so far they had done for themselves. As the years proved, the government singularly failed in this mission, which had at its commencement the seeds of failure in itself. A comparison between the last half of the British rule in India and pre-independence with the decade post-independence, that is 1951 to 61, brings out clearly the implication of the trends in agricultural production as an indicator of the economic change all over India. The slow overall growth of agriculture output in the first half of the century preceding independence stands in sharp contrast to the compound rate of growth of 3% per annum realized in the decades 1951 to 61. That is when India became independent. And to around 2.5% thereafter, the agricultural output has stood comfortably above this. Whereas in pre-independence period as a whole, most of the increase in output was achieved by increase in acreage, that means increase of more lands coming into agriculture. The actual yield per acre trended average around zero. In post-independent period as a whole, productivity per acre has increased and contributed as much as acreage to sustainable growth. Now, there were famines in the state as evident of the low level of productivity in the half century before independence. There were continued recurrence of famines. The dependence on monsoons for agricultural production was a main cause of famines. However, the famines were nothing like the famines which were experienced in the 19th century. The first serious shortage in the 20th century was in 1907 and 8. This was due to failure in monsoons. Again, in 1918 and 19, and in 1920 and 21, the experience was repeated, although not so severe level. In 1943, there was again a fairly severe food shortage. In the 20th century, improved transport systems and measures for famine relief by the government made the famines somewhat less drastic. The famines did not cause high mortality rates this time. It is argued that the increase in export of food grains, which benefited only those who secured the bulk of the profit from this trade, that is, the traders, caused the total quantity of food grains available to the people to be reduced. A study of agriculture output and its availability suggests that the output of food grains per head of population declined substantially, but the total supply of food grain was so small that the purchasing power of great many people was so low that one does not have to postulate the export of food grains as a cause for famine in the region. As these sections of population lived on the margin of subsistence, any serious shortfall in the production caused by bad monsoon was enough to cause acute scarcity. In fact, the export of rice declined steadily over the years, and the increasing consumption at home affected the export of wheat as well, and it even became necessary at times to have a net import of wheat. Let us look at another aspect, that is crop specialization in Maharashtra. In the 20th century, specialization in crop production was introduced, and there was a movement towards higher value crops, which were partly the result of the growth of export and domestic markets and partly that of the development of social overheads. Cotton, sugarcane and tobacco were introduced as main cash crops in Maharashtra. Since industries like textile mills and sugar factories are dependent on cotton and sugarcane, these cash crops are considered most important economically. Soon the whole of the agro-based economy in Maharashtra underwent change, and many agricultural industries and large cooperative farms grew to a large extent dependent on the production of these cash crops, that is sugarcane, cotton and tobacco. Large tracts of land now went under cultivation of sugarcane in the state. Almost 14% of the country's share of sugarcane is cultivated in the state. Even at present, Maharashtra ranks second in the state-wise cultivation of sugarcane. The sugar industries linked this crop constitute the main factor of agriculture in the state. Cotton also became an important cash crop in Maharashtra. Out of the total cultivation of cotton in the country, at present 36% of the total area is in Maharashtra. Cotton is cultivated in large parts of the state. Cotton is produced mainly in Vidarbha, then 25% of it is produced in Marathwada, while 10% is produced in Khandesh. Sugarcane cultivation figures are available from 1931 to 1961. These show an upward trend in the area under cultivation, also in the yield, but the returns in monetary terms are static. It was only in the post-independence period that the growth showed positive signs. Let us look at some of the problems of the farmers. The typical problems of the small farmers, however, in the first half of the 20th century, were major factors in inhibiting growth in the agriculture production at that time. What were these problems? They were rack renting. That means the farmers had to rent out their land to other farmers. Rural indebtedness, alienation of land, subdivision and fragmentation of the land holdings were major factors in inhibiting growth in agricultural production at that time. It is no doubt true that the population increase after 1921, by increasing the pressure on the land, aggravated the problems which were already there. But the problems themselves had to be traced to an origin other than unfavorable land-man ratio. The absence of an appropriate marketing organization and the inadequacies of the modern system of transport generally forced the peasant to sell to the local grain dealer, who was often also the village money lender and the purveyor of the commodities of commodities the peasants might require. As a result, the agriculturist very frequently did not get an adequate return for his produce and was forced to borrow in order to carry on his cultivation from year to year. The consequent indebtedness often meant alienation of land, and where the laws, as in the case of Punjab, prohibited the foreclosure of the mortgaged land by non-agriculturists, the rate of interest was pushed up and a class of peasant money lenders developed. It is difficult to say whether there was an absolute scarcity of capital in the Indian economy during this period. What, however, is certain is that the problems of distributing the available capital to the millions of agriculturists create a situation of acute scarcity from the point of view of the cultivating masses. In this context, the village moneylender performed the all-important function of providing credit when and where it was needed. Very often, as the only supplier of capital to the particular group of agriculturists, he was in a very strong bargaining position and was able to push up the interest rate to fantastic levels. Any attempt to deal with this problem, hence, had to encounter not only a powerful vested interest but the unfortunate fact that there was no adequate substitute for the village moneylender. High rates of interest were only one of the major disincentives to production so far as agriculturists were concerned. A steady rise in the rent payable on all arable land as more and more marginal land was brought under cultivation was a characteristic feature of the economic history of this period. Already, by the later years of the 19th century, the peasant proprietors had tended to develop into a rentier class. This tendency had evidently become very much stronger during the period of discussion. The characteristic development in the permanently settled areas was a proliferation of intermediary subtenures. So far as the fixity of tenures was concerned, the sharecroppers without any legal rights on the land they cultivated were the worst sufferers. Inadequate attempts to deal with the genuine problems, especially the question of fixity of the tenures, were made as early as the second half of the 19th century. Efforts by the British government in this direction were, however, generally stepped up in the 20th century. Among these were a series of tenancy legislations meant to guarantee greater security of tenure to the agriculturists and reduce the possibilities of extortion by the intermediary rent-receiving interests in the land. After 1937, the majority of the elected provincial government enacted legislations for the purpose, not without grim resistance from the rentier class. None of these legislations, however, aimed at the abolition of the parasitical rent-receiving interests, that is the moneylenders, which performed no useful economic function, and they were thus at best halfway compromise measures. During the period when land-man ratio was not unfavorable, that is before 1921, an adequate supply of capital could have encouraged the bringing of fresh land under cultivation in proportion to the need of the slowly increasing population. This would have obviated the necessity for dividing up the small holdings. A significant increase in productivity through changes in the techniques of and organizing of agriculture could also have prevented the holding from becoming nearly uneconomic. As it happened, however, capital scarcity prevented an adequate expansion of cultivation, as also the necessary changes in the techniques of production, so that the holdings tended to become smaller and smaller through subdivision, and their output tended to approach uneconomical levels. The fragmentation of the land holdings, which hampered the efficiency of cultivation, also followed primarily from the causes discussed above. Those who inherited the land wanted a share of every piece which was relatively fertile, and also insisted that the less fertile land should be evenly distributed among the inheritors. The limited maneuverability induced the small size of holdings, made them reluctant to give up any possible advantage, and encouraged them to insist that all possible disadvantages should also be equally shared. One of the most unhappy elements in the position of Indian agriculturists from the period of World War I onward was the persistently unfavorable effect of price movements on his real income. In the early years of World War I, which is 1914 onwards, the prices of food grains and of agricultural products generally remained relatively low, partly as a consequence of the administrative controls, while the prices of important items of mass consumption, for example cloth, went up considerably. The disparity between the price movements of agricultural and non-agricultural products continued through the subsequent decades, but was particularly pronounced after the Depression. The slump in the agricultural prices was far more severe than the one in the prices of manufactured goods. The actual effect of the slumps were variously modified by particular circumstances. Regions specializing in commercial crops suffered more than relatively self-sufficient communities, while peasants in possession of limited quantities of precious metals or liquid capital lived off them. At least in some instances, production increased to make up for the losses suffered through falling prices, and the volume of consumption of certain essential items like cloth did not always suffer a decline, because a shift to the consumption of poorer quality goods was often possible. But, to quote Professor Gadgil, the Depression rendered agriculture as a whole unprofitable, and by materially increasing the real burden of the agriculturist's monetary liabilities, it has made the position of the mass of cultivators absolutely helpless. An increase in the number of landless agriculturists is considered a typical feature of the economic history of India during 19th and early 20th centuries. The reduction of the agriculturist's income to an uneconomical level through high rates of interest, rack renting, and decline in the size of land holdings on one hand, and alienation of land through indebtedness and loss of tenancy rights through eviction on the other, are believed to have primarily contributed to this development. Looked at from another point of view, the increase in the number of landless agricultural laborers was also the consequence of the increase in population, which could not be absorbed into the non-agricultural sectors. The factors just mentioned are no doubt the most important determinants of the growth of this class in the 20th century. Unproductive capital. Now, why is the capital unproductive? Another negative feature in the agricultural development during this period concerns the unproductive use of capital. The capital invested in the landed estates cannot be described as productive investment, since they were no more than speculative investment meant to secure a rental income and did not contribute to the production in any way whatsoever. The capital which the agriculturist borrowed from the moneylender was no doubt used for productive purpose, but the result of such a productive investment was not so much any increase in output as the development of a pattern of distribution of the agricultural income, which siphoned off an increasing proportion of the produce as a share of the moneylender. In the long run, the supply of the credit by the moneylender thus became a parasitical rather than a productive use of capital. Positive steps taken by the government. One may mention some positive steps taken by the government as the appointment of Inspector General of Agriculture of all India in 1901, followed by the establishment of agricultural research institutes in 1903, the All India Board of Agriculture in 1905, and agricultural colleges at different parts of India. The positive efforts of the state did little to counteract the overwhelming weight of the various negative influences described above. Such increase in output as took place in Indian agriculture during this period was mainly in response to the market forces and the result of population increase. Later, in the wake of the constitutional reforms of 1919, provincial ministers for agriculture were appointed in 1921. The appointment of the Royal Commission of Agricultural Research was set up in 1929, helping to identify the problems of agriculture rather than solve them. After the 1935 Act came into operation, the provincial governments paid particular attention to agriculture in pursuance of a policy of rural development, but could achieve very little as they were in office only for a very short period. Much of the government's systematic efforts to improve agriculture was concerned with the introduction of improved variety of crop, and a certain measure of success was achieved with regard to rice, wheat, cotton, jute, groundnut and sugarcane. Such improvements, however, hardly touched the fringe of the agricultural problem. As late as 1938, only 6% of the land under rice was under the high-yielding varieties. The position with regard to cotton, thanks to Indian Central Cotton Committee, was only a shade better. No substantial increase in the producer's income resulted from the improvements suggested or adopted. Many of the technical innovations considered desirable were not acceptable to the peasantry, who lacked the necessary resources. In fact, while the low level of technique was undoubtedly a major factor in agriculture backwardness, no significant improvement in this regard was possible without changes in the organization of production, increased supply of capital, and substantial investment in overheads. The irrigation projects of the Government of India were more effective than the research undertakings in tackling the problem of low productivity insofar as they protected certain areas from excessive dependence on rainfall and increased productivity in certain other areas, some of which had been practically deserts. The recommendation of the Famine Commission of 1880 considerably pushed forward the work in this field, while the detailed program drawn up by the Irrigation Commission of 1900 to 1903 introduced a certain measure of system and direction. The major projects were classified as productive, that is, those likely to yield a rate of interest on the capital invested through increase in productivity or area under cultivation, and protective, that is, those considered essential for protection against famines. After irrigation became a provincial subject under the Act of 1919, a Central Bureau of Irrigation was set up in 1931 to coordinate research in this vital field. All projects which did not yield a substantial rate of interest were classified simply as unproductive. The magnitude, as also the inadequacy of the government's irrigation work, can be judged from the fact that the total area irrigated at their instance rose from 19.25 million acres at the beginning of the 20th century to 32.61 million acres in 1938-39. But this was only 13% of the total area under cultivation. The extent of irrigation varied considerably from province to province. It was as high as 88.1 and 58.3% of the total area sown in Sindh and Punjab respectively, while corresponding figures for Coorg was only 2.7 and for Bombay, that is Maharashtra, was only 4.5 in 1941-42. Let us look at the 5-year plans which were brought into effect by Jawaharlal Nehru after independence. The first 5-year plan, 1951 to 1956, had industrial growth of 8%. Agriculture had a sturdy growth. Agriculture and community development received 17.4% of the total budget of the 5-year plan. The most important feature of this phase was the active role of the states in all economic sectors. Such a role was justified at that time because immediately after independence, India was facing basic problems, deficiency of capital and low capacity to save. The first 5-year plan was a success. The monsoon was good and there were relatively high crop yields, boosting exchange reserves and the per capita income, which increased by 8%. National income increased more than the per capita income due to rapid population growth. Many irrigation projects were initiated during this period, including the Bakranangal Dam, the Hirakud Dam. The World Health Organization, with the Indian government addressed children's health, and reduced infant mortality, indirectly contributing to the growth of population. The government had taken steps to rehabilitate the landless workers whose main occupation was agriculture. These workers were also granted funds for experimenting and undergoing training in agricultural know-how in various cooperative institutions. Soil conservation was also given considerable importance. Thus, first 3 5-year plans had industrial growth and agricultural growth as well. The second plan succeeded particularly in the development of the public sector. The plans followed the Mahalanobis model, an economic development model developed by the Indian statistician Prashanta Chandra Mahalanobis in 1953. The plan assumed a closed economy in which the main trading activity would be centered on importing capital goods. Hydroelectric power projects and 5 steel mills at Bhilai, Durgapur, Rourkela were established. Coal production was increased. More railway lines were added, particularly in the northeast. Let us look at some of the historic water resources and the indigenous irrigation systems in Maharashtra. Maharashtra has scarcity of water, and the farmers have historically dealt effectively with these problems. Malgujari tanks in Vidarbha were constructed near about 2 centuries back. Dams like Khadakwasla, Darna, Bhandadara were constructed before 1926. The Neera canal system was constructed way back in 1980 and is still functioning very effectively. Radhanagari Dam in Kolhapur districts was constructed by the then ruler of Kolhapur state, and water is released from this dam into the rivers and stored in a series of Kolhapur-type weirs constructed on the rivers. Water is released by lifting the members. Water released is lifted by the members of the cooperative societies of farmers, and the main crop of sugarcane is harvested in this area. These cooperative societies have been functioning successfully for the last more than 80 years. The spread of canal irrigation in the 1920s attracted migrants, especially the Malis from Saswad, who were experienced with growing irrigated crops, to move into the canal tract and lease land from the local Maratha cultivators. It is a fact that the entrepreneurs who made use of canal irrigation did get richer than the small peasant farmers. The Green Revolution. It started in India in 1950s. It helped to remove the flaws of agriculture. New technologies for production of food grains developed in the Western countries were applied in India from 1951 onwards. Western scientists helped the developing countries by providing high-yielding seeds. Farmers had to purchase the pesticides and the fertilizers. Also, good irrigation was important for the crops. In Punjab, agriculture showed a great progress using the new technologies in the early parts of 1950s. Maharashtra did not benefit so much from the Green Revolution because permanently irrigated areas were only 17% in 1951. The majority part of the area was still dependent on rainfall, and consequently agriculture suffered from the low-level production. The need was felt to deal with social problems of the small farmers with small land holdings. They were producing only for self-sufficiency. It was necessary to encourage the farmers to increase their production and offer a greater portion of their products for sale in the market. Cooperative farming was introduced. Even before it was introduced by the government, Maharashtra farmers were aware of the benefits of cooperative farming. In fact, Maharashtra has a very strong history of cooperative movement. The cooperative lift irrigation schemes at Panchganga and Bhogwati rivers is more than half century old and is still successfully managed by the cooperative societies. The water allocation to the members of the cooperative societies is based on volumetric basis and is shared during the allocated time. The water use is very efficient and economical, and also the productivity of the crops is increased. After the cooperative farming was adopted on a large scale in many parts of western Maharashtra, agriculture grew by leaps and bounds, and Maharashtra has become the second largest producer of agri-products, especially sugar, cotton and pulses and vegetables in the whole of India. A note on intercropping in Maharashtra. What is intercropping? Intercropping is an indigenous and a sustainable method of cultivation which was traditionally adopted by the small farmers in the state. A scarcity of irrigation and fertilizers was always there. Priority was given to the cash crops of sugarcane and cotton. Whenever the peasant farmers do not have access to irrigation water and sometimes chemical fertilizers, they manage to get a greater yield per acre than single crop commercial farmers with the same inputs. How did this happen? In sugar fields, for example, small Maharashtrian farmers often grow wheat, maize, chickpeas, coriander and onions and harvest a good extra crop before sugar is tall enough to shade them or be hindered by them. Thus we see that Maharashtrian peasant scientists have an ongoing tradition of research so that new crops, new varieties and usable new techniques are thoroughly tested and adopted when they really prove to be increasing the yields. The small farmers' sugar fields had savory as an additional crop. Savory, the name is Sesbania aegyptica, is a small tree which grows at the same rate as the sugarcane, so that it neither shades it nor is shaded by it. Its trunk is stronger than sugar, so it helps to protect the sugar from the wind damage. The trunk provides wood and the leaves provide annual fodder when the field is harvested. Castor beans, chickpeas, coriander, onion, gourds, eggplant, okra, radish and wheat and 14 other crops were grown by the farmers without any extra land or resources. Jowar has traditionally been a major traditional crop in dry parts of Maharashtra. The farmers cleverly adopt their intercropping techniques to get the greatest benefit from local conditions. In areas where irrigation was not possible, the spiny safflower plant was the usual companion of jowar. Young safflower can be eaten as a green vegetable, while those which are allowed to grow to maturity produce oil seeds, while the spines help to discourage the grazing animals from penetrating too far into the grain fields. In fields where irrigation water is available, a little less safflower is planted and a lot more maize is planted. If there is insufficient rain in this part of Maharashtra for maize to grow unirrigated, but where water can be supplied, maize grows very well. And small farmers who don't have extra land supplement their income and family food supply very nicely by intercropping, which does little or nothing to reduce the yield of the jowar. Big land owners tend not to intercrop because they would have to hire labor to grow the companion crops, and in cold economic terms, this probably would not pay the big farmer very much. Small landowners, the tenant farmers and the sharecroppers can use family labor to maximize food production for the family. Intercropping enables hungry people to grow much of their own food with their own hands instead of waiting idly in urban slums for the welfare projects of food handout of grain produced commercially and inefficiently with only one crop in each field. A great unsolved problem in calculating the benefits of the fertilizer for small farmers is that increased yields means that the family is better fed. The increased amount of crops for sale is therefore not proportional to the increased input of fertilizer. In other words, statistics do not record the increase in yield achieved by the intelligent farmers with innovative intercropping. Thus we see that in Maharashtra, where the farmers have always been independent and self-sufficient, they generally manage to eke out a much better living than what the statistical figures reveal. In conclusion, we would like to sum up what we have seen so far, Maharashtra, like all other states in India, suffered low agricultural production in the last half century of British Raj. The rulers aimed to adopt policies which allowed them to centralize power and resources in the hands of the state. The slow overall growth of agriculture output in the period of 1900 to 1947 contrasts sharply with the growth of 2.2% achieved in the decade after independence, that is 1951 to 61. Thus we see that in spite of all the problems, agriculture in Maharashtra has shown a healthy growth in the last decade of the study, 1950 to 1960.